A white silence stretches across the highlands. Snow drifts like ash. A long pause. A scream cuts through the cold. Tonight, we descend into a landscape stained crimson against ice, where the cries of children once ricocheted through wind-scoured ridges, and terror learned how to hunt. This is the chronicle of a fear so invasive it reshaped an entire province into a living trap, a place where footsteps meant pursuit and dusk signaled death. Between 1764 and 1767, in the remote backcountry of Gévaudan, an intruder emerged, an entity that refused taxonomy, eluded annihilation, and dismantled certainty itself. It did not kill blindly. It stalked. It adapted. It chose. Its actions hinted at deliberation rather than instinct, at awareness rather than appetite. Survivors whispered of patterns. Officials noted preferences. Hunters encountered resistance that felt almost mocking, as if the land itself rejected their authority. This presence, later named the Beast of Gévaudan, cannot be dismissed as a rustic myth or a simple error of identification. What unfolded here was not merely violence inflicted by an animal, but a rupture in the philosophical foundation of Enlightenment France, a rupture that exposed how fragile humanity's dominion truly was. More than 200 surviving testimonies, royal decrees, parish ledgers, frantic letters penned by trembling hands, escaped the erasure of revolution and time. Together, they construct a portrait not only of bloodshed, but of unraveling belief. These records compel us to confront questions civilization insists it has resolved. Where does instinct end and intention begin? What separates wilderness from society when the boundary collapses? How thin is the membrane between order and chaos? The Enlightenment promised mastery through logic. What it received instead was panic. As deaths mounted, confidence decayed. Villages barricaded themselves. Neighbors accused neighbors. Faith fractured, science faltered, and authority eroded alongside it. Armed men scoured forests, yet returned empty-handed, or not at all. Each failure amplified dread, transforming rational communities into breeding grounds of suspicion and frenzy. When a threat cannot be named, it cannot be contained. Why do certain horrors refuse burial? Why do some nightmares persist long after their era has ended, reshaped by each generation to mirror its own uncertainties? The Beast of Gévaudan survives not because of what it was, but because of what it represents, nature's rebuttal to arrogance, the reminder that humanity's reign is provisional. This was never a simple episode of predators attacking the vulnerable. It was an existential confrontation, a moment when an age obsessed with progress was forced to consider that intellect alone might be an insufficient shield against forces older than language itself, forces that watched humanity rise and will watch it fall. In this documentary, we will explore 5 interlocking facets of the Gévaudan terror, each revealing why this manifestation of monstrosity continues to echo with increasing resonance. We will examine the calculated behavior that suggested awareness behind the killings, the communal disintegration born of prolonged fear, the collapse of scientific frameworks when faced with anomalies, the political humiliation of a crown powerless against the wild, and the unsettling realization that the beast functioned as a reflection, an obsidian mirror held up to ideals of reason, advancement, and supremacy. But understand this. What follows is not simply a forensic reconstruction or speculative zoology. It is a descent. Wind moves across empty highlands, bending frozen grass like a listening ear. A long pause. The terror of Gévaudan did not remain buried in the 18th century. It reached forward, into us. What unfolded in those years anticipated dilemmas that now stalk our modern world with renewed urgency. Long before climate collapse and biological erasure entered our vocabulary, this nightmare posed an unsettling question. What if the natural world is not passive matter, but an active presence, one that observes, adapts, and retaliates according to principles we refuse to recognize. When we study the creature's methods, its timing, its selectivity, its refusal to behave like any known predator, we glimpse an early echo of debates that now divide scientists and philosophers alike. Does the living world possess modes of awareness beyond human comprehension? Are there intelligences that do not announce themselves in language, yet still calculate, respond, and remember? A soft breath. As fear metastasized across villages, trust rotted from within. Friends became informants. Familiar faces turned suspicious. Doors once opened slammed shut at night. In this transformation, we recognize something uncomfortably recent. The same psychological corrosion surfaces whenever invisible, uncontrollable danger enters daily life. Prolonged threat fractures solidarity. Survival instincts override empathy. Community becomes collateral damage. The scholars of the era, armed with measurements, classifications, and Enlightenment confidence, attempted to contain the phenomenon through knowledge. They failed. Every attempt to define the intruder collapsed under contradictory evidence. It was too large, too cunning, too resilient. This breakdown exposes a perennial weakness. Knowledge systems are only as strong as the assumptions beneath them. When reality refuses our frameworks, certainty evaporates. A long pause. Power faltered as well. Authority dispatched hunters, soldiers, and experts, symbols meant to reassure the populace. Each unsuccessful campaign eroded legitimacy further. Protection defines sovereignty. When safety cannot be guaranteed, obedience dissolves. Gévaudan became a theater where political control confronted forces immune to command, reminding rulers and subjects alike that dominance over nature is often an illusion. Faith offered another explanation. Some proclaimed judgment. Others saw punishment. Here emerges a struggle that never resolves. How does one reconcile suffering with meaning? When devastation lacks discernible purpose, belief systems strain to contain despair. These questions return whenever catastrophe resists moral accounting. This is an examination where monstrosity is not limited to claws and fangs, but extends into philosophy itself. Where historical dread intersects with present unease. Where rational optimism disintegrates into something older, colder, and far less obedient to logic. A turning whisper. I will guide you through the blood-darkened pastures of Gévaudan, terrain where an impossible presence operated without restraint for 3 relentless years. What remains is not closure, but residue. Unresolved inquiries into awareness, ecology, and the precariousness of human safety. The path ahead demands more than curiosity. It requires the willingness to confront implications that destabilize comfort. To question whether humanity truly stands apart from the wild. To doubt whether intellect alone can decode existence. To accept that civilization may not shield us from entities governed by priorities alien to our own. They remind us, quietly and inexorably, that every age of illumination casts a shadow it refuses to examine. That each proclamation of dominion over the living world becomes an invitation for the world to answer back, revealing layers of complexity we were never meant to master. That every declaration of human superiority risks drawing the notice of forces capable of disputing that claim in languages of blood and loss we scarcely survive. If this descent unsettles you, stay with it. What the Beast of Gévaudan exposes about monstrosity is not confined to the past. Archived terror sharpens modern unease. Violence once recorded in ink now illuminates present fragility. Reflect on which dimension disturbs you most. The suggestion of thought behind unblinking eyes. The implication that the killings were intimate rather than random. Or the possibility that nature itself once turned toward humanity with intent. Because what 18th century France endured was not merely an anomaly of history. It was an early warning. A signal encoded in screams and official reports, cautioning that the natural systems we disrupt may respond in ways we neither anticipate nor control. As our own era provokes feedback from environments pushed beyond equilibrium, the lessons of Gévaudan grow louder, not quieter. Tonight, we begin with the most disturbing realization of all. The true horror of the Beast's 3-year campaign was not the number of dead, though more than 100 lives extinguished and countless bodies broken form a ledger of suffering impossible to dismiss. What chilled observers, both then and now, was the unmistakable impression of intellect guiding the slaughter. Something deliberate moved behind those jaws. Something that chose. This was not indiscriminate feeding. Hunger alone cannot explain the precision. The attacks revealed discrimination, patterns too consistent and too selective to be dismissed as chance. Young girls vanished while armed men were bypassed. Isolated figures were taken while groups passed unharmed. Certain households suffered repeated losses, as though marked. Parish registers and military memoranda recorded each incident with bureaucratic coldness. Dates, locations, wounds, names. When assembled, these fragments exposed not randomness, but preference. More unsettling still was the creature's capacity to adapt. Early encounters described sudden rushes from cover. Later, the approach changed. The attacker learned. It exploited ravines, hedgerows, and uneven ground, striking from angles that cut off escape. It positioned itself beyond effective musket range, yet close enough for victims to recognize death before it arrived. This was terrain mastery, the kind expected from seasoned human trackers, not animals governed by instinct alone. Witnesses did not say they glimpsed it. They said they were watched. Accounts described figures frozen in place, as something lingered at the tree line, motionless, assessing. Some victims were stalked for days, their routines mapped, their vulnerabilities catalogued. The strike came only when circumstances aligned perfectly, when no help could arrive in time. In several incidents, the creature injured rather than killed, retreating just far enough to remain unseen. Rescuers rushed in and were attacked. It understood compassion. It weaponized it. It also appeared to grasp the limits of human technology. It retreated when weapons were raised, advanced when panic disrupted coordination. This was not fear. It was calculation. Most disturbing of all were reports of recognition. Survivors claimed it returned to the same families, the same paths, the same faces. Some swore it paused before striking, as though confirming identity. These encounters seeded rumors of vendetta, of memory. The aftermaths deepened the unease. Bodies were not always consumed. Some bore injuries inconsistent with feeding. Organs removed with specificity. Limbs arranged with unnatural order. Corpses positioned as though meant to be found. These were not the chaotic remains of a meal. They suggested intention, acts that bordered on the ceremonial. Each detail pushed observers toward an unthinkable conclusion. That the violence was not merely physical, but expressive. That something in the forest was not just killing humans, but communicating. And if that were true, then the terror of Gévaudan was not about death alone. It was about the collapse of a boundary humanity depended on for psychological safety. The belief that thought belongs exclusively to us. Some remains were recovered only partially devoured, yet the most nourishing flesh lay untouched, an absence more unsettling than consumption. It was as though nourishment ranked low among motivations. In other cases, bodies appeared in places no animal would reasonably choose, hauled uphill or positioned in exposed clearings, requiring exertion far beyond necessity. These placements suggested intention, display, a desire not merely to kill, but to be witnessed. Physicians summoned to examine the dead responded with the tools of their trade: observation, notation, measurement. What they recorded still exists, preserved in archives, clinical accounts written with a rigor uncommon for the period. Their language is restrained, almost detached, yet the implications are chilling. The injuries showed order. The strikes followed patterns. Flesh was opened with efficiency rather than frenzy. Violence expressed discipline. The anatomical sketches expose a grim precision. Vulnerable points were targeted repeatedly: the throat, the femoral region, the cervical spine, with a consistency that implied either intimate anatomical understanding or a history of lethal trial and error refined over time. One doctor remarked, with evident unease, that the attacker demonstrated knowledge of the human body surpassing that of many trained surgeons, striking exactly where collapse would be swift and resistance minimal. Consider which possibility disturbs you more: that an animal possessed awareness approaching our own, or that this presence shattered the boundaries we rely upon to define reality itself. These accounts resonate uneasily today, as debates over animal cognition and ecological agency challenge long-held assumptions about humanity's place within the living web. The reaction of society proved as revealing as the killings. As fear deepened, theology strained under the weight of explanation. Villagers and clergy alike sought meaning, crafting doctrines to justify why a sentient malevolence would be permitted to roam in fur and sinew. Some declared it chastisement for communal wrongdoing. Yet this raised a darker question. Why would divine correction take the form of an intelligent hunter rather than flood, famine, or flame? Others insisted the creature was infernal in origin, a demon cloaked in flesh. That explanation collapsed when prayers failed and rites produced no relief. Pastoral correspondence reveals a church wrestling with contradiction, attempting to reconcile doctrine with an adversary that appeared to think, yet lacked a soul as theology defined it. Military engagement evolved in parallel. Early patrols gave way to operations of increasing sophistication. Strategy shifted toward coordinated movements, pattern analysis, predictive positioning, methods reserved for confronting human opponents. Reports speak of morale, deception, even attempts at psychological pressure, though the authors openly questioned whether such concepts applied to what they faced. The frustration bleeding through these records is unmistakable. Disciplined officers realized they were contending with something that studied them in return. Each adjustment met with counter-adjustment. Each plan unraveled. Philosophers watching from afar recognized the deeper implications. If animals could harbor awareness rivaling humanity's own, the moral hierarchy justifying domination trembled. If the natural world could generate intelligences guided by values alien to human ethics, then the narrative of creation itself demanded revision. Gévaudan forced thinkers to stare into a conceptual abyss, one that threatened the carefully arranged ladder separating reason from instinct, person from beast. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony concerned behavior that exceeded survival. Witnesses recounted episodes where the creature appeared to toy with its targets. Not pursuing immediately. Circling. Advancing, retreating. Drawing out terror. Such actions suggested enjoyment, or at least fascination, with fear itself. One survivor described how it fainted repeatedly, prolonging the ordeal, as though savoring panic before disengaging. The implication that cruelty could exist outside humanity violated every comforting belief about nature's moral neutrality. The sounds it produced compounded the horror. These were not the familiar calls of wolves. Accounts described layered vocalizations, modulated sequences that shifted with context. Some insisted the noises bordered on speech, not words, but structures hovering at the edge of language. Later historians compiled testimonies from those who claimed the creature spoke, though none agreed on meaning. The sounds occupied a liminal space, close enough to recognition to unsettle, too alien to comprehend. And beneath all of this lingered one unanswered question. Was this intelligence solitary, or shared? Because the possibility that the hunter did not act alone, but as part of a coordinated presence, opens a final and deeply unsettling dimension, one that leads further into the darkness ahead. Numerous testimonies complicate the already disturbing picture. Villagers, soldiers, and clerics alike reported sightings of more than one presence moving with unsettling coordination. These were not chaotic rushes driven by instinctive hierarchy. The movements appeared deliberate, synchronized. Attacks erupted in separate valleys within the same hours, distances impossible for a lone body to traverse, yet the methods matched with eerie consistency. The same points of assault, the same restraint, the same calculated aftermath. Such patterns forced contemporaries toward an unthinkable conclusion. The menace might not have been singular. This raised the specter of shared cognition. A system rather than an individual. Either communication flowed between bodies with speed and precision no one could explain, or something like a unified awareness animated multiple forms at once. In this framing, the beast ceases to be a creature and becomes a structure, a network of perception and intent distributed across flesh. Modern scholars who have catalogued centuries of predator attacks across France find Gévaudan standing grotesquely apart. Nothing comparable appears before or after. No escalation of cunning. No adaptive counter-strategy. No prolonged campaign marked by learning and refinement. The evidence forces a trilemma. An unprecedented individual with extreme intelligence. An unknown species possessing advanced cognition. Or a phenomenon that destabilizes our most basic assumptions about how awareness arises in the natural world. The legacy of this apparent awareness refuses confinement to archives. It reverberates in contemporary research revealing problem-solving birds, tool-using cephalopods, mammals capable of memory, grief, and deception. It echoes in discoveries of botanical signaling networks where trees exchange information, warn one another, and allocate resources cooperatively. Each finding erodes the myth of human exclusivity and resurrects the unease first crystallized in Gévaudan. If the living world harbors intelligences governed by values alien to our ethics, if it can adapt, anticipate, and counter our defenses with strategic refinement, then humanity's position atop a cosmic hierarchy becomes not destiny, but assumption. As climate disruption accelerates and ecological systems respond in cascading, patterned ways, the parallel sharpens. Storms dismantle infrastructure with surgical efficiency. Pathogens evolve around medical barriers. Extinction chains ripple outward with systemic logic rather than randomness. Each phenomenon whispers the same implication the beast once roared. Nature responds. The predator of Gévaudan becomes a historical prototype. A case study in how the environment answers intrusion not with passivity, but with adjustment that feels uncomfortably intentional. And this leads us deeper. The most corrosive damage inflicted did not occur in forests or fields. It unfolded in kitchens, churches, and marketplaces. Fear seeped inward, dissolving the social glue that had held these communities together for centuries. Over 3 relentless years, Gévaudan became an unintended experiment in collective breakdown. Anxiety metastasized. Suspicion replaced familiarity. Mechanisms of blame emerged with brutal efficiency, redirecting helpless rage toward neighbors. Accusations spread, of complicity, of witchcraft, of provoking wrath. In some villages, interpersonal violence rivaled the predator's own toll. This psychic contagion outlasted the killings themselves. The beast destroyed bodies. Terror dismantled trust. Communities once sustained by shared labor and ritual fragmented into isolated households, each braced against both wilderness and one another. Commerce faltered first. Markets emptied as travel became a gamble with death. Trade routes fell silent. Celebrations rooted in collective identity were abandoned or conducted under armed escort, transforming joy into vigilance. Agricultural life suffered most cruelly. Fields lay beyond the safety of walls, forcing impossible choices: exposure or starvation. Each day's labor became a calculated risk. Parents weighed hunger against orphanhood. Children vanished from open spaces. Games ceased. A generation grew up associating sunlight with vulnerability and trees with ambush. Paths once walked without thought became corridors of dread. Groves turned predatory. Home became hostile terrain. Civilization did not collapse all at once. It eroded, quietly, steadily, under the pressure of an enemy that could not be named, reasoned with, or reliably opposed. And once fear learns how to hollow a society from within, it never truly leaves. Marriage, the quiet machinery through which communities reproduce themselves, began to fracture almost immediately. Parish registries reveal a sudden distortion in courtship and union during the years of terror. Young women, the beast's favored quarry, were effectively confined indoors. Customs that required movement between hamlets, evening gatherings, seasonal festivals, vanished. Suitors could not travel. Families forbade daughters from leaving sight. The result was a sharp collapse in marriages between 1764 and 1767, followed by a frantic surge once the killings ceased. Yet these delayed unions bore strange characteristics. They crossed customary class, village, and kinship boundaries. Long-standing social filters that once governed who married whom no longer held. Fear reordered priorities. Survival replaced tradition. The marital landscape exposed a society permanently altered, its invisible architecture bent under prolonged terror. The economic damage cut deeper still. Roads that once stitched Gévaudan into the wider economy transformed into corridors of death. Merchants refused passage unless compensated for risk. Prices for grain, cloth, and salt climbed beyond reach. Markets emptied not only from scarcity of goods, but from absence of bodies willing to move them. Agriculture followed. Farmers retreated from distant plots, abandoning fertile land to weeds and predators alike. Harvest shrank. Storage thinned. Hunger pressed inward. Governance faltered. Tax collection, dependent on officials traveling between settlements, nearly collapsed. Without revenue, coordinated defense disintegrated. Poverty magnified exposure. Those without means to fortify homes or hire guards faced a brutal calculus: starve inside or gamble with death outside. Frontier societies endure because danger is predictable. Bandits, famine, illness, these threats follow recognizable patterns. Institutions exist to counter them. Gévaudan broke that grammar. The menace obeyed no rhythm. Defensive systems designed for familiar crises did not merely fail. They created gaps the predators seemed to exploit with unnerving precision. Class resentment ignited. Peasants watched nobles preserve ancient hunting privileges while children died. Forests remained protected for sport as commoners bled beneath their canopies. Aristocrats, in turn, condemned villagers as irrational, accusing panic and superstition of sabotaging organized resistance. The clergy stood stranded between these poles, tasked with offering solace while lacking explanation for relentless slaughter. This threefold fracture, class, authority, belief, paralyzed collective action. Each group spoke past the others. Cooperation decayed. Conflict multiplied. From this vacuum emerged conspiracy. Whispers spread that the beast was no accident. Some claimed elites had trained it to discipline the poor. Others insisted the killings were punishment for hidden heresies, naming neighbors as culprits. Rumors accused certain families of bargaining with the creature, exchanging information for immunity. The fact that some households remained untouched while others were struck repeatedly transformed survival into suspicion. Grief curdled into accusation. Loss demanded meaning. Meaning demanded blame. The beast did not merely prey upon flesh. It infected relationships. It turned endurance into evidence of guilt. In doing so, it revealed how existential threats fracture societies long before they destroy them outright. The pattern is not unfamiliar. When danger is invisible, uncontrollable, and unnamed, fear turns inward. Trust becomes expendable. Communities begin to consume themselves, not because they are weak, but because certainty has vanished. Do you recognize the pattern? Spiraling suspicion. Fear amplifying itself. Nuance collapsing into outrage. The paranoia that gripped Gévaudan bears an uncomfortable resemblance to modern hysteria, where rumor outruns verification and outrage becomes a form of belonging. When danger refuses prediction, how does a society preserve coherence without tearing itself apart? No figure embodies this ambiguity more clearly than the man credited with killing what authorities ultimately accepted as the beast. Local memory crowned him savior. Contemporary records tell a murkier story. Before the final shot, he had been suspected, first quietly, then openly, of benefiting from the terror. Accusations circulated that he profited through protection schemes, that he possessed uncanny knowledge of the creature's movements, that his eventual triumph felt arranged rather than accidental. After the killing, redemption never fully arrived. He received neither lasting honor nor formal condemnation. Instead, he lived beneath a residue of doubt. His experience reveals a brutal truth. Once trust fractures, resolution does not mend it. Even the removal of the threat cannot restore what suspicion has corroded. Outsiders fared worse. Gévaudan's culture had long depended on openness. Trade routes, pilgrimage paths, seasonal movement, all required hospitality. Fear inverted this ethic almost overnight. Strangers became liabilities. Merchants were detained as potential collaborators. Pilgrims were turned away from sanctuaries. Even military units sent to assist encountered hostility, viewed as burdens or accomplices rather than protection. Isolation fed itself. Vulnerability intensified fear. Fear deepened isolation. What had once been connective tissue hardened into barricade. Genealogical studies tracing family lines through the crisis reveal consequences extending far beyond the 18th century. Certain surnames became permanently stained by accusations of collaboration. Descendants faced exclusion from marriages, trades, and leadership generations later, punished not for actions, but for suspicions born in panic. Meanwhile, families who claimed participation in the beast's defeat converted those narratives into prestige, founding local dynasties that endured long after the terror faded. Fear did not disappear. It reorganized inheritance. Women endured the sharpest contradictions. They were the primary targets, prompting restrictions that resembled confinement more than protection. Yet survival itself provoked distrust. Why did some live when others died? Whispers followed survivors, implying bargains struck in secrecy. One woman, celebrated for wounding the attacker when armed men failed, spent years under scrutiny. Her success violated expectations. Female agency, emerging amid collective helplessness, inspired anxieties that sometimes eclipsed fear of the predator itself. Information systems collapsed under strain. In communities reliant on oral transmission and mutual confidence, rumor became currency. Exaggeration conferred authority. Claiming exclusive knowledge brought status. Each retelling accumulated horror. Accuracy lost value. Sensation thrived. Eventually, the informational environment grew so polluted that coordinated response became impossible. Action drowned beneath noise. Religious life mirrored these fractures. Official doctrine urged submission to divine will. Popular belief demanded intervention. Competing shrines promised protection. Amulets circulated. fear became commerce. Accusations of witchcraft resurfaced as communities searched for human faces to attach to inhuman terror. Mystery was unbearable. An enemy, even a false one, felt preferable. Scholars of crisis observe a consistent pattern. Societies under extreme stress rarely collapse outright. Instead, they reconfigure, often in ways more destructive than the original danger. In Gévaudan, the beast destroyed lives. The response dismantled community. Mutual reliance gave way to defensive clustering, bonds forged not by trust, but by shared fear. When the killings finally ceased, when carcasses were displayed and each was proclaimed the beast, the violence ended. The damage did not. Communities that fractured under the weight of terror discovered a bitter truth once the danger receded. Suspicion, once awakened, does not obey commands to sleep again. Trade partnerships shattered during the crisis resisted repair. Agreements once sealed with a handshake now demanded guarantees no one could provide. Marriage alliances poisoned by accusation remained broken, their fractures passing quietly into family memory. What emerged was a hardened social landscape. 3 years of fear produced scar tissue, rigid boundaries where relationships had once flowed freely. Guarded postures replaced hospitality. Casual glances became evaluative. Conversation carried the undertone of interrogation. Through dread alone, the beast accomplished what no invading army could have imposed, a reordering of society around fear instead of kinship, vigilance instead of warmth, division instead of cohesion. That this transformation endured long after the killings ceased suggests a grim lesson. Social contagion can outlast physical predation. Communities may survive an external threat yet remain crippled by the behaviors that threat awakens. In this sense, the most enduring monster may not have prowled the forests at all, but emerged within neighbors forced to navigate a world they could neither comprehend nor command. And so we move deeper. The age placed its faith in order. To name was to know. To classify was to control. The creature that haunted Gévaudan shattered this confidence with quiet efficiency. This was not a simple error of identification. Not a wolf misjudged in darkness, nor a bear inflated by fear. The presence occupied a liminal space between categories, slipping through every attempt at definition. Each label required the dismissal of contradictory evidence. Each conclusion demanded selective blindness. Nature, it seemed, had produced something that refused the filing cabinets of human understanding. Naturalists responded as their training dictated. They observed, compared, catalogued. Their failure revealed the limits of rational method when confronted with phenomena that exceeded precedent. The unease this produced ran deeper than scientific embarrassment. It hinted that knowledge itself, so recently crowned sovereign, might be insufficient. Letters between scholars circled the same problem again and again. Wolf, yet too large. Hyena, yet behaviorally implausible. Lion, yet geographically impossible. Hybrid explanations multiplied not because they clarified the evidence, but because no existing framework could contain it. Eyewitness descriptions, strikingly consistent despite originating from largely illiterate observers, painted a form that violated expectation. Larger than any known wolf, yet built unlike one. Limbs elongated beyond proportion. A head oversized for its neck. A tail described not as ornament, but as instrument, employed with purpose unknown in local fauna. Color proved equally destabilizing. Witnesses disagreed, reporting fur that seemed to shift with light and angle, tawny, ruddy gray. Whether this reflected adaptive camouflage or limits of perception, no explanation satisfied. When a massive animal was killed and presented as the answer, the examination that followed betrayed an institution straining to preserve authority. Measurements were recorded, then questioned. Descriptions drafted, crossed out, rewritten. Marginal notes revealed disagreement. Certainty appeared, then dissolved into qualification. Closure was required. Clarity was not forthcoming. The killings continued. This resistance to classification threatened more than empirical order. Taxonomy carried theological weight. Creation was assumed to be intelligible because it was divinely ordered. If nature could generate forms that defied comprehension, then either the world operated with a freedom unsettling to belief, or humanity's capacity to understand it had been vastly overstated. Both possibilities were intolerable. The beast did not merely evade hunters. It evaded meaning. In doing so, it exposed a fault line beneath confidence itself, a reminder that reason's dominion is conditional, and that the living world may harbor realities unconcerned with our need for coherence. More unsettling than the creature's distorted anatomy was the logic, if it can be called that, governing its behavior. It did not hunt as hunger dictates. It bypassed exposed livestock to pursue guarded humans. It ignored lone men to attack those who posed greater resistance. It killed without feeding. It returned to familiar paths not because prey was plentiful, but because something about those places mattered. These decisions violated every zoological assumption of the age. Natural historians trained to interpret animals as bundles of reflex and drive confronted actions that implied deliberation, preference, evaluation. To explain the evidence honestly required acknowledging cognition, an admission Enlightenment science was ideologically invested in refusing. Animals were mechanisms. Anything more threatened the philosophical scaffolding of human exceptionalism. As certainty collapsed, hybrid explanations multiplied. Scholars stitched together known species in desperate combinations. Wolf and dog. Wolf and hyena. Even lion-based conjectures. Each proposal attempted to domesticate the unknown by assembling it from familiar parts. Yet every solution bred contradictions. How did African animals reach the French interior? What reproductive logic could yield stable offspring with such incompatible traits? Rather than resolving anomalies, these theories expose taxonomy's inability to absorb genuine novelty. The resistance to classification invites a deeper question. Does this failure reveal weaknesses in how knowledge itself is structured? What might persist unseen in the gaps between our categories, unnoticed not because it is absent, but because we lack the conceptual tools to register it? The international response to this failure is equally revealing. Across the Channel, the Royal Society maintained a conspicuous silence. Its published proceedings from the period omit any reference to events convulsing French scientific circles. The absence is striking. Engagement would have required confronting evidence that strained prevailing systems. Silence preserved coherence. Ignorance became insulation. German scholars proved less restrained. Less bound to rigid frameworks, they entertained possibilities others rejected outright. Correspondence traces a gradual shift from skepticism to unease. Initial doubts gave way to acknowledgement of consistencies that could not be dismissed. Some speculated that environmental pressures might generate unprecedented forms, an idea hovering near evolutionary thinking decades ahead of its time. French counterparts dismissed such views as speculative, yet offered no better alternative. The absence of physical evidence deepened the crisis. Despite numerous killings attributed to the beast, tangible remains proved elusive. Carcasses vanished. Skulls disappeared. Pelts decayed or were destroyed before examination. Specimens that might have settled debates did not persist. This vacuum invited darker interpretations, suppression, embarrassment, or material properties that resisted preservation altogether. The lack of proof became its own data point. Later historians identified a deeper flaw exposed by Gévaudan. Circular reasoning lay embedded within classification itself. Only what fits existing categories is recognized. Categories are built solely from what has already been recognized. Novel phenomena therefore appear not as data, but as errors. Monsters by definition. The beast forced a reckoning with the possibility that the monstrous is not rare deviation, but a recurring consequence of limited perception. Even mathematics faltered. Early applications of probability attempted to chart attack frequency, predict locations, impose order through numbers. The results collapsed. Violence clustered, then scattered. Preferred territories shifted without ecological cause. Victim profiles resisted smoothing. Again and again, expectation failed. The behavior was not random, but it was not predictable either. It was as though something adjusted in response to observation. And if that were true, then the failure of classification was not merely academic. It suggested that reason itself had encountered an adversary capable of evasion, one that adapted not only in flesh, but in strategy. The collapse of mathematical order deepened the unease. Tools designed to extract structure from apparent chaos produced only contradiction. Either invisible variables operated beyond perception, forces no equation could touch, or randomness itself ruled in ways that shattered deterministic faith. For thinkers convinced the universe could be reduced to calculation, this failure struck at the core of certainty. Medicine offered no refuge. Physicians who examined the aftermath of attacks expected clarity from flesh and bone. Instead, they encountered impossibility. Jaw pressure suggested crushing force beyond any known European predator. Claw spacing aligned with no catalogued species. Tissue damage implied reactions inconsistent with familiar mammalian saliva, patterns hinting at processes medicine could not yet explain. Rather than resolving debate, clinical documentation multiplied enigmas. Each attempt to force the evidence into known models required increasingly strained logic, satisfying neither science nor intuition. Faith attempted classification where reason faltered, and failed just as completely. If the terror was divine correction, why did it manifest in such a singular, aberrant form? If infernal, why did consecrated weapons and ritual protections yield no effect? If merely natural evil, what law of creation permitted such deviation? Theology fractured alongside science, revealing a shared dependence on rigid frameworks unable to absorb true anomaly. The implications reached far beyond the 18th century. Modern investigations uncover organisms thriving in environments once deemed sterile. Species emerge that defy evolutionary expectation. Hybrid forms blur reproductive boundaries. Microbes flourish in extremes once thought lifeless. Each discovery quietly mocks the assumption that nature conforms to human diagrams. As ecological disruption accelerates, irregularities multiply. Species merge into unprecedented zones. Behaviors surface that contradict established models of animal cognition. Traits appear that strain genetic explanation. Again and again, the living world demonstrates a creativity exceeding our frameworks. The Beast of Gévaudan stands as a precedent, a reminder that confident classification may be a comforting illusion rather than an accurate map of reality's endless invention. And when knowledge fails, power follows. The response of the crown revealed a deeper vulnerability. Even absolute authority falters when confronted by forces beyond governance. From the palace, power radiated in theory to every village and valley. In practice, it dissolved at the forest edge. Here was a sovereign whose word commanded armies, whose edicts shaped lives, yet whose dominion meant nothing to an adversary that recognized no borders, laws, or legitimacy. The beast acknowledged neither crown nor country. It answered to no hierarchy but its own imperatives. Royal hunters were dispatched. Soldiers marched. Rewards were proclaimed. Each failure echoed outward, eroding the illusion of omnipotence. Subjects began to grasp a dangerous truth. If authority could not protect them from the wild, what did sovereignty truly guarantee? In Gévaudan, power met its limit, not in rebellion, not in foreign invasion, but in the simple fact that dominance means nothing against an enemy that cannot be negotiated with, intimidated, or understood. And once authority is exposed as fragile, everything beneath it begins to tremble. This collision between sovereign authority and untamable nature exposed a fracture at the core of Enlightenment absolutism. Claims of divine mandate meant nothing to a presence that recognized no God, no crown, no cosmic order beyond necessity. The Beast of Gévaudan was not merely a regional menace. It became a referendum on power itself. Political historians of the Ancien regime note how deeply the crisis unsettled the foundational assumption of monarchy, that protection justified obedience. When the crown failed to neutralize a predator within its own territory, despite mobilizing resources capable of prosecuting European wars, legitimacy began to erode. If royal power could not guarantee safety from an animal, what exactly did sovereignty promise? The escalation reveals a slow awakening to this danger. Early reports reaching Versailles were dismissed as rustic exaggeration, another episode of peasant panic best handled locally. But as deaths multiplied and the regional economy began to suffocate, indifference became impossible. Royal attention shifted from reluctant acknowledgement to urgent necessity. The arrival of Captain Duhamel's dragoons in early 1765 marked the first public admission that this was no routine wolf problem. Months of disciplined sweeps and sustained operations produced nothing. Their failure dealt a visible blow to royal prestige. Each unsuccessful campaign echoed far beyond Gévaudan, feeding whispers that the crown's reach might be shorter than proclaimed. Correspondence preserved from this period shows the king growing personally entangled in the crisis. His letters pulse with irritation that edges into fury, astonishment that a single predator could defy the machinery of state. Beneath the concern for subjects lies a deeper anxiety, fear of symbolic defeat. The appointment of François Antoine, the king's own gun-bearer and celebrated hunter, signaled extraordinary escalation. He was granted authority normally reserved for suppressing rebellion or confronting foreign enemies. The beast had become a test of rule itself. Victory would affirm absolutism's promise. Failure would expose its limits. The financial commitment underscored the stakes. Bounties exceeded the yearly income of prosperous merchants. Elite hunters were imported at costs comparable to commissioned officers. Specialized weapons were forged, expenses rivaling the arming of entire regiments. Much of this spending was quietly obscured in royal accounts. Wealth, however, proved meaningless against an adversary operating on the brutal economy of survival. Military humiliation cut deepest. Dragoons hardened by continental warfare found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered. Drives that should have cornered any ordinary animal collapsed into emptiness. Zones declared secure erupted with fresh killings. The predator appeared to anticipate strategy, exploiting the rigidity of human planning. Force, so effective against people, failed against something ungoverned by human logic. When François Antoine finally killed a massive wolf in September 1765, the crown seized the moment. Despite lingering attacks and persistent local doubt, victory was proclaimed. The carcass was paraded with ceremony, transported under guard, displayed before relieved courtiers. Official declarations announced the crisis resolved. This was governance as theater. The ritual mattered more than accuracy. Authority required an ending, even if reality refused to comply. The declaration did not end the terror. But it restored the image of control, briefly reinforcing the illusion of a monarchy still capable of imposing order upon the world. That illusion would not endure. Because when power performs certainty in the face of unresolved danger, it does not eliminate doubt. It merely postpones reckoning. When the killings resumed only weeks after the Crown's declaration of victory, authority faced an impossible choice. Admit deception, or preserve the illusion. Versailles chose silence layered over insistence, publicly affirming the beast's death while quietly financing renewed hunts in the countryside. Truth became politically inconvenient. Fiction hardened into policy. The consequences reached far beyond Gévaudan. Enlightenment political theory justified absolutism through an implicit bargain. Subjects surrendered autonomy in exchange for protection. Here, that bargain collapsed. If the monarchy could not shield peasants from a single predator, what rationale remained for obedience? Critics of royal power no longer needed abstraction. Gévaudan provided a living argument, one that undermined absolutism more effectively than philosophy ever could. Regional nobles were caught in the fracture. Tasked with maintaining order, they lacked the means to confront a threat beyond local capacity. Appeals to Versailles brought interference that weakened their authority without delivering safety. Peasants accused nobles of preserving hunting privileges while children died. The crown accused nobles of exaggeration and incompetence. The beast exposed contradictions embedded within feudal hierarchy, fault lines that would later split the regime apart. Studies of early modern justice show how quickly legitimacy decays under sustained insecurity. Every failed drive. Every renewed attack following official reassurance. Every whispered acknowledgement that deaths continued despite proclamations of safety reinforced the belief that power existed to preserve itself, not to protect the vulnerable. Spiritual authority fractured alongside political power. If monarchy ruled by divine sanction, what did its impotence imply about divine favor? Clergy struggled to explain why prolonged slaughter persisted under the reign of a king styled as God's chosen. Sermons multiplied interpretations, collective sin, spiritual trial, demonic interference, but none reconciled suffering with providence. When prayer failed as completely as muskets, doubt seeped into foundations once thought immovable. International reaction sharpened the humiliation. European gazettes circulated the story with relish. Beyond France's borders, readers learned that the continent's military giant could not secure a single province. British newspapers savored the irony, contrasting French claims of martial supremacy with the crown's inability to stop an animal. The reputational damage exceeded that of many battlefield defeats. This was not misfortune. It was incompetence made visible. The personal toll on the king was profound. Observers described a ruler increasingly consumed by reports from Gévaudan. He demanded updates, lashed out at messengers, raged at news of continued deaths. For a monarch raised within the mythology of near-divine authority, the beast's defiance struck at identity itself. Accounts note his withdrawal from public ceremony during the crisis, a tacit admission that visibility invited dangerous questions. Why could God's anointed not stop a single predator? The beast did not merely kill subjects. It unmasked power. It revealed that sovereignty, stripped of effectiveness, collapses into performance, and that performance cannot indefinitely conceal failure. In Gévaudan, authority confronted a truth it could neither suppress nor escape unchanged. Power means nothing to forces that do not recognize it. The Beast of Gévaudan exposed a truth far more unsettling than physical danger. When terror persists, authority fractures, faith erodes, and meaning collapses. The monarchy's final handling of the crisis revealed how fragile power becomes when it depends on illusion. When Jean Chastel killed the creature in 1767, long after victory had already been proclaimed, the crown faced humiliation it could not acknowledge. To recognize his success would have meant admitting deception. Instead, officials diminished his role, insisting the true beast had been slain years earlier, and that Chastel had merely killed an ordinary wolf. No one believed it. But the fiction allowed authority to survive on paper, even as credibility dissolved in memory. That memory endured. In the years leading to revolution, pamphlets returned to Gévaudan again and again. If the king could not stop the beast, they asked, how could he govern a nation? The predator became a symbol, not of savagery, but of a regime incapable of confronting reality, clinging instead to ceremony, denial, and performance. The deepest rupture, however, was spiritual. The killings shattered theological certainty. Why would a benevolent God permit faithful peasants, children, mothers, entire families, to be torn apart for years without reprieve? Clergy offered explanations. Punishment. Trial. Mystery. None endured contact with lived suffering. Parish priests recorded despair as they buried the dead, privately doubting the words they were compelled to speak. Confessions increased. Processions multiplied. Prayer intensified. Nothing changed. When sacraments failed to protect and devotion produced no safety, forbidden questions surfaced. If God was good, why this? If omnipotent, why silence? If just, why the innocent? As doctrine weakened, folk belief surged. Charms appeared. Local saints were invoked. Improvised rituals spread through villages desperate for presence where theology offered absence. This was not rebellion. It was survival. The beast did more than kill bodies. It revealed divine silence, political weakness, human vulnerability stripped of comforting narratives. And once those truths surfaced, they could not be buried. Listen carefully, because this is where faith itself began to bleed. Not from doubts whispered in salons or arguments staged in books, but from amulets crushed in trembling hands and prayers screamed into forests that did not answer. As the killings continued, the spiritual landscape of Gévaudan transformed as violently as its social one. Blessed objects appeared everywhere. Medals stamped with unfamiliar saints. Scraps of cloth pressed against distant relics. Charms passed from house to house with urgent instructions murmured like spells. These were not gestures of devotion. They were last defenses. Pilgrimages multiplied. Entire families risked the very roads where death waited, believing this shrine, this saint, this specific intercession might succeed where God, abstract, universal, remote, had failed. Providence felt too broad to trust. What people demanded now was precision. A name. A guarantee. Protection that could be held. Practices long condemned resurfaced openly. Folk blessings. Unauthorized prayers. Hybrid rituals blending Christian language with older, forbidden traditions. When orthodoxy proved powerless, survival eclipsed obedience. Doctrine collapsed under urgency. Theological certainty does not erode slowly. It shatters through repetition. Gévaudan did not offer a single tragedy to be absorbed into mystery. It delivered sustained, documented slaughter. Every funeral reopened the question. Every dead child forced confrontation with a God who did nothing. How many unanswered prayers does it take to break a belief system? Parish priests recorded despair alongside baptisms and burials. Notes never intended for public eyes reveal men trained to explain suffering who suddenly had no language left. They buried families they had known since birth. They spoke words they no longer trusted. Faith persisted not because it convinced, but because nothing else remained. Intellectual defenses followed. Some argued divine will permitted evil for reasons beyond human comprehension. Others insisted greater goods hid within horror. The logic was careful, impeccable, and unbearable. When one cleric suggested the killings might create future saints through martyrdom, grief erupted into fury. Parents did not want metaphysics. They wanted their children alive. More austere doctrines seized the moment. Human corruption. Divine inscrutability. Wrath long denied now revealed. Pamphlets circulated quietly, claiming the suffering was deserved. Even this certainty collapsed under scrutiny. If punishment was the point, why no moral pattern? Why the innocent first? And then there were the children. No theology survived them intact. They died disproportionately. Explanations curdled as soon as they were spoken. Inherited guilt sounded obscene. Claims that their deaths warned adults felt monstrous. Arguments that early death spared future sin turned mercy into cruelty. Each attempt to explain made God colder, not wiser. Miracles only deepened the wound. Some survived encounters and swore divine intervention saved them. Others prayed with equal devotion and were torn apart. Piety offered no protection. Sin offered no penalty. The devout died screaming. The careless lived. Providence appeared random, or absent. What does that do to belief? What happens when prayer becomes indistinguishable from silence? Historians now recognize this moment as a breaking point. Demands for evidence, specificity, and explanation had already begun to surface. Gévaudan supplied facts too concrete to dissolve into mystery. This was terror recorded in ink, counted in bodies, impossible to spiritualize away. Providence could not explain it. Reason could not classify it. Power could not stop it. This is where belief stopped asking questions and began begging. When prayer failed, ritual escalated. Despite no clear evidence of demonic possession, exorcisms were performed on forests, crossroads, and fields where blood had soaked the ground. Rites meant for spirits were recited over flesh and soil. Holy water was cast into wind. Latin commands echoed through empty valleys. Nothing changed. The failure was devastating. If the beast was not demonic, then those who insisted evil must be supernatural were wrong. But if exorcism itself was powerless, then what authority did the Church truly possess? Some clergy retreated into a darker explanation. The beast was an instrument of God, beyond exorcism's reach. Yet this answer poisoned its own roots. If the killings were divine will, was resisting them an act of rebellion against God? Across nearby Protestant regions, interpretation turned accusatory. Pamphlets smuggled into Gévaudan claimed the beast was judgment, retribution for persecution, for forced conversions, for injustices still fresh in memory. This reading enraged Catholic authorities, but it found listeners among those already wondering whether buried wrongs had returned to collect their debt. Theological disagreement hardened into sectarian hostility. Another fracture split communities already cracking under fear. But the deepest wound was this. The suffering seemed to mean nothing. Theology can endure pain with purpose, punishment, testing, martyrdom. Gévaudan offered none. The beast killed without moral logic. Victims were neither especially sinful nor notably holy. Their deaths inspired no reform, strengthened no faith, redeemed no community. The violence appeared gratuitous. This was the true heresy. Suffering without reason threatens every religious framework built on justice and meaning. To accept it required admitting either divine cruelty or divine absence. The consequences lingered long after the killings stopped. Children who grew up during the beast years carried a lasting disengagement from faith. Parish records show declining participation. Seminaries struggled to recruit. Mandatory observance continued, but belief thinned. The silence experienced in childhood hardened into skepticism, into withdrawal, into vacancy. The beast did not only kill bodies. It hollowed belief. In Gévaudan, traditional explanations confronted empirical evil, documented, repetitive, undeniable, and failed. Intellectual defenses collapsed. Severe doctrines offered no comfort. Folk protections dissolved into desperation. No system could console a parent who prayed for protection and received a mangled corpse instead. And in those unanswered questions, why my child, why no mercy, why nothing, we hear echoes that persist across centuries. This is where the journey ends, though resolution never arrives. Between 1764 and 1767, something moved through the forests of southern France and dismantled certainty. It exposed the limits of reason, the fragility of social trust, the impotence of power, and the silence of heaven. It forced humanity to confront the possibility that the world contains forces indifferent, or hostile, to our survival. The Beast of Gévaudan endures not because it defied explanation, but because it explained us. It revealed how quickly order dissolves, how fragile meaning becomes, how thin the barrier is between civilization and terror, and why monsters do not need to last forever, only long enough to show us the truth. Do not mistake this story for the past. That is the final illusion the Beast of Gévaudan destroys. These events are not relics from a forgotten province. They are warnings, signals burning across centuries, aimed directly at a modern world intoxicated by control. The Beast matters because it exposes vulnerabilities we still carry, vulnerabilities our technology disguises but never removes. When we examine the creature's apparent awareness, its selectivity, its adaptation, its refusal to behave like blind instinct, we confronted a possibility that still terrifies us. That nature may harbor forms of intelligence operating by logics that do not privilege human life. Logics that value us no more than we value insects beneath our feet. Not cruel. Not moral. Simply indifferent. When we traced the social unraveling of Gévaudan, we saw a rehearsal for the present. Communities did not collapse because of death alone, but because prolonged threat dissolved trust. Neighbors became suspects. Survival eclipsed solidarity. The Beast did not need to destroy society. Fear accomplished that far more efficiently. When classification failed, science confronted its limits. The problem was not absence of data, but absence of containers. Knowledge systems designed to organize the familiar proved helpless before the genuinely anomalous. The Beast did not fit because it existed between categories, where frameworks thin and certainty evaporates. When authority faltered, the lesson was merciless. Power functions only within systems that recognize it. The Beast acknowledged no sovereignty, no hierarchy, no divine mandate. And neither do many of the forces we face today. Authority collapses the moment it confronts threats that do not negotiate, obey, or fear. And when faith fractured, the most unsettling truth emerged. Some suffering does not instruct. It does not purify. It does not redeem. It simply is. Theological certainty shattered against the bodies of children, revealing how fragile meaning becomes when silence answers prayer. The Beast endures not because it was explained, but because it cannot be. It represents mystery that resists assimilation. Every generation reshapes it, because every generation is haunted by the same question. What if we are not in control? The Beast becomes a mirror. It reflects our fear that we are observed by systems we do not understand. That we are evaluated by forces immune to our values. That our position atop creation is not destiny, but assumption. This is why it refuses burial. In every disease that leaps species boundaries with eerie efficiency, its echo returns. In every climate disaster that dismantles infrastructure with surgical precision, its logic reappears. In every digital panic that turns neighbors into enemies, Gévaudan fractures again. In every governmental failure before existential crisis, Versailles repeats itself. In every attempt to extract meaning from random suffering, we hear the same unanswered prayers. The countless explanations offered: wolf, hybrid, trained animal, murderer, demon, punishment, reveal less about what the beast was than about what we need. Each theory bent reality to preserve comfort. Each avoided evidence that threatened certainty. The abundance of explanations did not signal understanding. It signaled conceptual poverty. A lack of frameworks capable of holding experiences that exist between categories, where the truly monstrous lives. And perhaps that is the final lesson. The Beast of Gévaudan did not merely stalk forests. It stalked the boundaries of human understanding. And those boundaries are far closer than we like to believe. The beast's greatest horror was never its teeth. It was its refusal to stay inside our ideas. Modern efforts to solve the mystery, counting bones, reanalyzing archives, assigning species, missed the deeper wound. Whether the Beast of Gévaudan was wolf, hybrid, or human matters far less than what it exposed. Its true terror lay in its conceptual uncontainability. It could not be filed, named, or neutralized through explanation. That failure mattered more than any corpse. The physical creature died in 1767. The metaphysical beast did not. That second beast, born from uncertainty, remains alive. It embodies the opacity of nature to human understanding. The possibility of forms of awareness we cannot recognize. Of forces that operate according to logics alien to our moral frameworks. Every attempt to fully explain the beast diminishes its significance, because its meaning lies precisely in what it resists. At the center of this unease is consciousness. If the killings were purely instinctual, comfort remains possible. Instinct can be modeled, predicted, controlled. But evidence suggesting intention, strategy, learning, even cruelty, forces a darker confrontation. What if nature contains minds that observe us as we observe animals? What if decisions about our lives are made with the same casual indifference we extend to creatures we deem lesser? In that moment, nature ceases to be backdrop. It becomes agent. The historian J. M. Smith reached a devastating conclusion. The Beast of Gévaudan marked an inflection point where medieval and modern worldviews collided, and both failed. Medieval thought could contain monsters within divine hierarchy. Enlightenment reason demanded classification and control. The beast occupied the space between, exposing gaps neither faith nor science could close. That unresolved tension left scars deeper than the death toll. Communities never fully healed. Social trust did not return. Families linked to beast encounters carried stigma across generations. Religious faith, shaken by prolonged silence, declined permanently. Economic relationships rebuilt not on confidence, but caution. The beast killed more than individuals. It destroyed assumptions about humanity's place in the natural order. And this is why Gévaudan still matters. As climate collapse forces us to confront nature as actor rather than resource, the beast reads like prophecy. Cascading extinctions ripple through ecosystems with systemic logic. Diseases cross species boundaries with uncanny efficiency. Weather patterns adapt to human defenses as if learning. All echo the same warning first written in blood on French snow. Nature responds. Not always consciously. But not always blindly. The hunt never ended. It only moved. Into laboratories struggling to explain anomalous data. Into governments confronting failures that should not have been possible. Into theology straining to justify suffering without meaning. Into digital panics that turn communities against themselves. Wherever certainty collides with anomaly, the beast is there. We remain prey within systems we have disrupted but do not understand. Observed by agencies we cannot name. Subject to logics that include us, but do not center us. And that may be the most frightening legacy of all. The Beast of Gévaudan leaves us with a final, merciless reminder. Our place at the top, of food chains, of social orders, of imagined hierarchies of being, is never guaranteed. It is provisional, temporary, always subject to revision by forces that do not care about our stories of dominion, progress, or supremacy. History teaches this lesson quietly, and then violently. Until we meet again in those territories where the past refuses to stay buried, where familiar explanations rot under scrutiny, where certainty dissolves into dread, where old monsters illuminate new vulnerabilities, I remain your guide. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, leading you through landscapes where human knowledge falters and inhuman awareness may find opportunity. Remember this above all else. The Beast of Gévaudan does not live in archives or footnotes. It lives in every moment when nature displays agency we did not predict. When patterns emerge that feel too deliberate to dismiss. When intelligence manifests in forms we fail to recognize, until recognition becomes unavoidable. The hunt never ended. It only learned patience. We remain prey in systems whose rules we never wrote, played by intelligences we cannot comprehend, for stakes that may include the survival of a species that mistook dominance for destiny. In every sound outside your window, well, if you can, in every anomaly in the natural world, in every coincidence that feels too precise, something may be watching, evaluating, deciding, according to values that would terrify you if you could perceive them clearly. The beast is dead. Long live the beast, eternal, adaptive, and waiting in the spaces between what we know and what knows us far too well.